Kinsale is a beautiful maritime fishing town located on the southern coast of Ireland with a rich and diverse historical background. Originally, Kinsale was known solely by its Irish name, Kiontoya, which directly translates to head of the sea, a very fitting name given its location. It was known by many names before Kinsale was adapted, such as Kinsale in the 14th century, in reference to the title Baron Kinsale, awarded to the de Courcy family, and Adelfronda, also in the 14th century, which was used on Spanish and Italian maps and meant noble leaf. Some other names it was known as include Adelforda, Arfor, Andeltari, Cantelfronda, Endelford, Guizala, Quinsala, Kinsale and Kinsale de Einworth.
Most of Kinsale's history flows from the harbour, which was formed at the end of the last ice age. As the glaciers left the landscape here, they carved out a perfect sheltered inner harbour and a more exposed outer bay. Perfect in the golden age of sailing ships then.
Anglo-Normans arrived to Ireland in the early 12th century. This is the time when the first version of Kinsale was built, but historians are not sure exactly when. The earliest known charter is from 1334, written by the British King Edward III. This is when we count Kinsale's birth from. The Anglo-Normans had a lot of conflicts with the neighbour Irish. They had a lot of wars and battles. Because of that, these people had death in their everyday life. In the 15th century, the walls was built, but the Irish people didn't live inside the town walls. They lived outside in the skilly with minimum rights or privileges. Because of the deep harbour, bigger ships was able to come to the town, and it was a good chance for Kinsale to grow as a market town. The marketplace was built in the middle of Kinsale, and all the streets are going there, so it was like the heart of the town.
So here we are at Desmond Castle, which was built 500 years ago as the customs house of Kinsale. And to understand why it was built here, really have to look at the location of Kinsale, a medieval walled town back then, built on the bend of the River Bandon. And of course, the only way in and out of that walled town was through a gate. And at each of those gates stood gatekeepers who taxed the trade, imports and exports. So here would have stood the main Cork gate, as this is the main road to Cork back then. And a lot of trade was taxed coming in and out of here. So with that system, it was an amazing system because less than a dozen gatekeepers could then tax and control all the imports and exports of the harbour. The castle was built by the Fitzgeralds, who were the Earls of Desmond, and they collected and stored the local taxes. So it was initially built as a customs house, and it evolved into the main town prison. So through the 1700s, this is the main English-run prison along the coast here. And a lot of the prisoners were French, as the traditional enemy of the English were the French back then. So it's locally nicknamed the French prison. And Desmond Castle in the heart of medieval Kinsale.
In 1381, a stone wall was ordered by King Richard to be built around Kinsale town to protect the town from outside threats, such as Spanish, Irish and rebel English enemies of the king. Along the wall were gates, which were used to enter and leave the town, and where taxes were collected by gatekeepers. Blind Gate, formerly known as St. Nicholas's Gate, was the closest gate to St. Malta's Church and was named after the patron saint of fishermen, coppers, merchants, brewers and repentant thieves. Smugglers often used this gate to bring goods in and out of the town, as it faced inland and gatekeepers could be bribed into allowing them to not pay full duties. Eventually, this gate had to be bricked up and blinded, earning it the nickname Blind Gate, as it is known as to this day. There were 2 water gates built in Kinsale along the dock sides of the walls. They were also the busiest gates in Kinsale and were used by boats to bring goods in and out of Kinsale. Cork Gate was located by Desmond Castle and got its name from its street, Cork Street, which originally was the main road from Kinsale to Cork City. Because of this, it was the busiest inland gate and met many merchants coming and going from Kinsale each day to trade. The World's End Gate was located near the end of the town and was built facing the inner harbour. It earned the name the World's End because the Americas had not yet been discovered at the time this gate was built, so it is believed that past the coast of Ireland was the end of the world. Friars Gate was located by the old Carmelite Abbey and was mainly used by the friars to come in and out of the town. The abbey was built in the mid-14th century and is placed outside of the town walls.
The Battle of Kinsale was a pivotal moment in Irish history. This momentous encounter shaped the present we live in today.
It was September of 1601 when the events in Kinsale began to unfold.
Eventually, 26 ships that had sailed from Spain filled the picturesque harbour, and in their holds were 3,500 armed Spanish fighters. The town was taken with a little resistance. The small group of soldiers defending the town retreated to Cork City and recounted the startling narrative of this unexpected Spanish invasion to their superiors.
The English response was swift. Lord Mountjoy marched with his army from Dublin to Kinsale. While making his way to West Cork, Mountjoy used scorched earth tactics with the aim of rendering the envoys around Kinsale useless for provisioning the Spanish invaders, but also bringing untold suffering and deprivation on the local native Irish. The Irish arrived in Kinsale in early December, 7,000 strong. They camped inland and attempted to cut off British supplies. As time went by, the weather became colder and supplies began to run low. As time wore on and the weather worsened, tensions in the Irish camp began to fray as which war strategy to follow. O'Neill favoured a more measured battle approach, waiting for the hostile weather and diminishing English provisions to take care of their enemies. However, Red Hugh O'Donnell favoured a frontal assault on the British garrison.
The Spanish, when presented with the choice of fighting their enemies on the battlefield, of starving them out, sided with O'Donnell, and it was decided that a surprise attack would be launched on the British.
It was decided that Christmas Eve 1601 would be the date of the battle. It was a typical Irish December day, cold and wet when the Irish began their march. Due to further discord between O'Neill and O'Donnell, the Irish marched in separate armies. This was because they couldn't agree on who would lead the forces. As dawn broke over Kinsale, O'Neill arrived to something completely and utterly unexpected. The British were ready on horseback. The British horses, much larger and better trained than the Irish horses, charged and attacked them several times. On the third such charge, the Irish formation crumbled, their defences succumbing to the English attack. In a panic frenzy, the Irish armies turned heel and ran, sealing their fate.
The retreating Irish were massacred. In a matter of 3 hours, the Battle of Kinsale was over. In the coming days, the Spanish reached an agreement with Mountjoy, and in the spring, a Spanish fleet was allowed to Kinsale to return their defeated army home. O'Neill agreed terms with Mountjoy, which resulted in him leaving with many of the other rebel chieftains in what was called the Flight of the Earls in 1607. This eventually stemmed into the beginning of the Ulster Plantations 10 years later.
Red Hugh O'Donnell continued his efforts against the English, travelling to Spain to attempt to encourage a larger armada. He died in 1607, rumoured to have been poisoned by a member of the Spanish court. The English realised the strategic importance of Kinsale and constructed 2 large forts, James Fort and Charles Fort. Kinsale became one of the most fortified ports in the world. British military were stationed there and their families settled in Kinsale. The economy thrived from the wages of these soldiers and supplying them with provisions. A new age of prosperity had dawned in Kinsale.
James Fort, or Dúnarí Séamus, was an early 17th century pentagonal bastion fort. It would have had a commanding position guarding the Harbour of Kinsale and monitoring seaborne advances on the town. Prior to James Fort being constructed, an earlier medieval fortification was on the site. This fortification was named Castle Ní Park and was occupied for a time by Spanish forces during the early part of the 1601 siege of Kinsale. It was captured, however, from the Spanish by Sir Richard Smith, who led attacking English forces of Lord Mountjoy. Construction of James Fort commenced in 1602, immediately after the siege of Kinsale. The fort was named after James I of England and VI of Scotland, and was built to designs by Paul Ive to replace and supplement the older medieval structure. Completed by 1607, the central structure was a half-bastioned, four-sided stone fortification, surrounded by pentagonal earthworks to a star-shaped fort design. A hexagonal blockhouse was also built on the water's edge at the narrowest point in the channel. As with Charles Fort, James Fort was occupied by Jacobite forces during the Williamite War in Ireland. It was captured, however, in 1690 by Williamite forces after being damaged by an explosion of gunpowder stores. Following the building of Charles Fort on the opposite side of the harbour in the late 17th century, James Fort became known as the Old Fort, or in Shandangan. Though the new fort, Charles Fort, was operated as a military garrison up until the early 20th century, James Fort declined in use during the 18th century, and texts and maps describe it as a ruin by the 19th century. Now listed as a protected national monument and managed by the Office of Public Works, the fort is open to visitors. The James Fort site is publicly accessible and is visited both as a tourist attraction and as an amenity park by walkers and runners.
The ruins of Charles Fort are on the outskirts of Kinsale, overlooking the harbour.
Built between 1678 and 1682 and named after the reigning king Charles II. Charles Fort is a classic example of a star-shaped or bastion fort. Consisting of 12 acres within the walls, the fort was built around earlier defensive structures. Charles Fort was constructed for the British Army. Its purpose was to prevent an invasion of Ireland by Britain's European forces. Star-shaped forts were the most effective form of defence during the age of cannon and musket fire. Charles Fort has 5 bastions or projecting towers on the outer walls linked by curtain or joining walls. This star design allows defenders to bring cannon crossfire on attacking forces. The walls are low and thick, circa 12 metres wide. At its height, there was 94 cannons on site, a formidable deterrent for any attacker. The fort is very strong on its seaweed side, but its landward defences was never fully completed. This weakness was exploited in October 1690 in a fierce battle for the fort between forces loyal to King William III and those loyal to King James II. 1,200 men loyal to James II held Charles Fort. William III deployed 10,000 men to attack. William's army attacked from the higher ground on the weaker landward side. A 13-day siege of heavy and constant cannon fire ensued until the eastern wall of Charles Fort was breached. The fort surrendered and William's army were victorious during the one and only battle on site.
For the following 232 years, Charles Fort was utilised as an artillery and an infantry barracks, a training ground in times of war and a military depot. Internal buildings were constructed, such as the Jordan Barrack Squares, in the mid-1700s. Providing additional and improved accommodation for the soldiers and officers, an average of 440 men and their families were based in the fort at any one time. During the War of Independence, the 1st Battalion, Essex Regiment, were stationed in Charles Fort. Mid and West Cork experienced many turbulent years and battles. Following the signing of the Anglo-Irish Treaty, the British Army evacuated Charles Fort in February 1922. In the Irish Civil War that followed, Charles Fort was burned by retreating anti-treaty forces from the 10th to 12th August 1922. Charles Fort was then abandoned, and for many years it fell into decay, a reminder of Ireland's role and association with the British Empire. But a rebirth followed when it became a popular camping ground by Boy Scouts and playground for local children. Hippies established a commune in the fort in the late 1960s. In 1973, Charles Fort was declared a national monument. Today, Charles Fort is managed and maintained by the Office of Public Works. Restoration, conservation and maintenance works are ongoing. Annually, close to 100,000 visitors step over the drawbridge and are transported back in time when they witness this remarkable fort's architectural splendour and hear tales of its historic and colourful past.
Even more than its military history, the ghost of the White Lady remains in the fort. It was a tragedy worthy of Shakespeare. It begins when the daughter of Governor Warrender, commander of Charles Fort, falls in love with Sir Trevor Ashurst, and they get married. After the wedding festivities, later that night all duties were returned to as Charles Fort operational. The newlyweds took an evening stroll, and the young bride was distracted by a beautiful pink flower growing below. A young sentry offered to go get the flower as the wedding gift if the groom would mind his post. The groom took up the post with the sentry's musket and waited. With no sign of the sentry, he dozed off to sleep, leaning on the musket. Later that night, Commander Warrender took his rounds and found the sleeping groom. Mistaking him for the slacking sentry, the commander raised his gun and fired, later realizing he was shooting his son-in-law in the heart. He was so grief-ridden and unable to face the judgment of his daughter, he made the decision to kill himself by throwing himself off the battlements. The young bride woke up from a deep slumber and went in search for her husband, only to find his dead, bloody corpse. She looked over the ramparts and saw the broken, dead body of her beloved father. It was too much for her to take in. She made a drastic decision to leap to her tragic death. From that day, the bride's heartbroken spirit haunts the fort, dressed in her wedding gown, and despairs. When this area was being excavated, 2 skeletons were found, one male and one female. It is presumed that these are the bodies of the White Lady and her father. At that time, anyone who committed suicide could not be buried in sacred grounds and were buried where they died.
Anne Bonny was born on the 8th of March 1698, her birth name being Anne Cormac, daughter of a servant woman, Mary Brennan, and her employer lawyer, William Cormac. The family travelled to the New World very early in Bonny's life. At first they had a rough start in the New World. Her father failed to establish himself as an attorney, so he joined a profitable merchant business. According to historians, Bonny had a very hot temper. At 13, she stabbed a servant girl with a kitchen knife. She married a sailor, James Bonny, who hoped to win her father's estate when her father died, but she was disowned for marrying him. Somewhere between 1714 and 1718, they moved to Nassau, the haven for English pirates on New Providence Island. Bonny soon started mingling with the pirates in the taverns and met Calico Jack Rackham, then apparently became his mistress. They had a child in Cuba who took the name Cunningham. Bonny soon after rejoined Rackham and continued her pirate life, divorcing her husband and marrying Rackham at sea. Bonny, Rackham, and Mary Read stole the Revenge that was anchored in Nassau port.
In 1720, they were attacked by a king's ship captained by Jonathan Barrett under commission from the governor of Jamaica. Most of Rackham's crew did not put up a fight as they were too drunk to fight, but Bonny and Read fought valiantly. Bonny carrying a pistol and a machete. Most of the time, according to sources, the crew and all were captured in the end, though to be hanged. According to Barrett, her last words to Rackham were, "I'm sorry to see you here, but if you'd fought like a man, you need not be hanged like a dog." Bonny and Read were put on trial and sentenced to be put to death, but they pleaded their bellies, saying that they can't hang women quick with child. Their sentences were delayed until their terms were up. Mary Read died in prison, apparently from a fever, and this is where Anne Bonny's story ends. Up to now, there is no proven fate for her.
Patrick Cotter O'Brien was born in Kinsale in 1760. He stood at 8'3". He suffered from a rare disease called gigantism. He was the first of only 13 people to surpass 8 feet. Once in England, Patrick adopted the stage name of O'Brien. He worked for many years as a bricklayer, an easy job for someone at his height. He did not even have to use a ladder to reach the roof of the cottage he worked. Later, he joined a traveling show and made his fortune as a freak, and claimed he was 9 feet tall, wearing special height-boosting shoes, also claiming he came from a huge family of giants from Ireland. Ironically, one of Cotter O'Brien's closest friends was the shortest man in the world at the time, standing only 3 feet tall.
On September 8, 1806, Cotter O'Brien passed away at the age of 46. No hearse was long enough to accommodate his 246-centimeter casket. Instead, 14 men were called upon to carry him to his grave. He left £2,000 to his mother and requested his body to be entombed behind 12 feet of rock to prevent exhumation. Despite his final wishes, Cotter O'Brien's body was exhumed 3 times, in 1906, 1972, and finally in 1986.
There are literally hundreds upon hundreds of shipwrecks everywhere along the Irish coast. If you looked at a map of the world, there are more shipwrecks around Borneo and the Straits of Malacca, Southeast Asia, and the next place where there are most shipwrecks is the western approaches to Europe, between Ireland and France, heading for the English Channel. Probably because that was a sea route you're going back to the New World, ships departing, the centre of trade, Europe. A microcosm of that is around here. You can see from this map here, there were literally, because you didn't have the benefit of no radio, no GPS, they were constrained by sailing at the time. You didn't have the motor power lot pre-1880, so you were constrained by the wind. You couldn't sail as close to the wind as you could today with a yacht, so sailing was quite cumbersome, and you had no weather forecasting, so you were at the mercy of the gods. And particularly, one of the reasons there's such a density, particularly around here, is because on the southwest coast of Ireland, the Old Head is the last of the headlands on the southwest coast. From the Old Head all the way to the Loop Head, there's just a series of peninsulas all the way out. And from the Old Head, after that's the last kind of major peninsula, you're going to Cork Harbour and Kinsale, which are 2 major shipping ports. So a lot of ships there were coming from the west. They often mistook the 7 heads for the Old Head, or the galley head for the Old Head and all that, and ended up inside in the bay. The prevailing wind is southwest, which would drive you into the bay. Cork Black Sherry Bay, which we're looking at over here on the other side, it's a very treacherous bay, and there are huge loss of life, huge shipwrecks. Probably outside after the Lusitania, the most famous is probably the city of Chicago. I went in there in Ringagorty in 1892, in thick fog, dense fog, going very fast. The ship broke in 2. Everybody was rescued that clambered up the rocks, and I have a photograph of an old photograph from 1892, and you've got jaunting cars, Jarvies, from there all the way down to the gate, waiting to take passengers to Kinsale, and there's nobody lost. And that was one of the last major shipwrecks prior to Lusitania. There was huge loss of life then. Probably the biggest loss of life were the Lord Melville and the Boadicea. They were wrecked in Garrettstown between the 2 beaches on a reef called Drogheda-na-Fian. And they were wrecked there in 1816, and there were nearly 300 people lost during the 2 shipwrecks there, mostly off the Boadicea. Their bodies, the washed up bodies, were interred on a sand dune where the car park in Gary Lucas is now. That was called Bunconn Moor. It's gone now. There was a gentleman from Cork, an antiquarian, in the early 1900s walking along, and he found some bones and skulls everywhere, and he arranged to have the skeletal remains reinterred in Old Cork graveyard, which is between here and Sandy Cove. So a few years after 1822, the Albion was wrecked just west of between Garrettstown and House Strand. Again, only 9 survived, and there was something like between 30 and 40 passengers lost. Some of those are interred in Timpletrine outside Ballinspittle, and included was the daughter of the Governor of Upper Canada, Anne Powell. There was a lieutenant who was a general in Napoleon's army. He's interred there as well. So there was quite a few well-known people on that aboard that vessel. I've them all, the ones that are recorded in the press and historically in my book, No Flowers in a Sailor's Grave. I do a lot of place name research as well, and it's very interesting in the place name research. The place names are key to finding out about shipwrecks a lot of the time. Just down here near the Speckled Door, there's a little cove there, and it's called Cushina Dina Bata, which means the little coos of the drowned people. And in 1868, the Stonewall Jackson was lost there, you know, and a little bit of local cross-discipline research, you know, archaeology, history and folklore. There was a local man in the pub one day, and he was talking to a local diver, and he was saying, "Did you ever hear of a ship called the Stonewall Jackson?" "Oh, I did." He said, "Do you know where she went down?" He said, "I don't, but there's a coos over there, and it's called, I think she was over there, something called Cushina Dina Bata, the little cove, the drowned people." And the diver went over there and he found a couple of bits and pieces. The ship was being towed into Kinsale, and the skipper, Captain Russell, was afraid that the guy who was towing would claim salvage, so he threw off the tow rope and he ended up washed in there. Everybody was lost. And there's a little mass grave, a little mound on top of the cliff where the sailors are interred there. The captain and his wife were buried in Belgooly, Captain Russell. The only reason they knew it was his wife, there was only one woman aboard, and they found her, and they found her ring, and they knew the captain had his wife travelling with him. So there was a massive, huge amount of vessels lost over the years. And then with the advent of motor power and the decline in sail, there were less shipwrecks, because vessels were able to manoeuvre off the shore. The advent of radio came in, different technology improved, so it was less. But then you had the World War, the First World War, and the U-boats and minefield moorings and vessels like the Lusitania, and there's a litany of wrecks off the old head, litany of them. And today we hardly have any shipwrecks today. It doesn't happen anymore. So the shipwrecks in deeper water tend to survive better. There's no light penetrating to the bottom, and they stay relatively intact for a long time. Whereas if you have a timber ship, schooner, 90 or 100-foot schooner, and it comes in here in the shore, within 20 years there's absolutely nothing left. You might find a couple of little metal artifacts.
The first restored signal tower in Ireland, built by the British during the Napoleonic Wars, is a lookout tower and signal post, using the flag and ball signalling system.
The signal towers were built during the Napoleonic Wars, when there was a lot of difficulty here with rebellion, particularly the 1798 rebellion and the French invasion, unsuccessful invasion into Bantry Bay in 1796. The British thought, the English thought, that they should build signal towers along the Irish coast from Dublin all the way around up to Mallinhead and Donegal, 81 in number, to watch out for a possible other French invasion, which never happened. Napoleon, of course, was defeated in 1815 at the Battle of Waterloo, and that put an end to that. These towers were then left to dereliction after that time. So we have restored this one, and it's the only one in Ireland which has been fully restored. The signal tower was based on what was known as a flag and ball signalling system. There was a ship's mast here, which would be 50 feet tall, which would be nearly twice as tall as this building. This building is about 30 feet tall. There's a page of a code book, which gives an idea of how the signalling system worked. Now, it was run by a naval lieutenant in the room upstairs, and the only entrance to this building was on the first floor. He got up by ladder, pulled the ladder up after himself, and then they went up on the roof to watch out for possible French shipping. But the signalling system was based on this code book. Depending on the combination of flags and ball raised meant a different message. And as I often tell people, my favourite one is the last one. When they raised the Union flag, it meant mistake made in last message. So I suspect they flew that quite a lot.
The signalling system was very limited in its efficiency because, as you know, along the coast here, half time it's foggy in the morning, the evening, darkness, obviously it's useless. Bad weather conditions, poor visibility, and most of them are about the one of the Seven Heads, Ballymac Redmond. You can barely see it from here on top of the Seven Heads. That's exactly 7 miles away. And the next one to the east is another 7 miles, Barry's Head. That doesn't exist anymore. So trying to see, like today, the one Ballymac Redmond top of the Seven is a bare dot. So even today with good visibility, you wouldn't be able to see it.
But I suppose what it did mean was that there was a military presence. The signal tower was restored and opened in 2015. The second part of the project here was to build a Lusitania Memorial Garden, as Lusitania was sunk about 12 miles from here, just off the old head lighthouse. So we've built a Lusitania Memorial Garden, which you will see. Following that, we intend to build a museum on this site if we can get planning permission, and that is well advanced at this stage.
The museum within the tower contains memorabilia and information on the Lusitania disaster.
The British transatlantic ship, the Lusitania, was the best of its type and built to carry over 2,500 passengers.
In May 1915, the Lusitania was returning from New York to Liverpool. As the Lusitania was passing the old head of Kinsale on May 7, 1915, tragedy struck. A torpedo hit the side of the ship. Shortly after, a second explosion occurred inside the ship, which was possibly caused by the damage to the ship's steam engines and pipes. The ship sank in only 18 minutes. The Lusitania was attacked by a U-20 command by Kapitan Leutnant Walter Schwieger. The ship sank approximately 18 kilometers off the old head of Kinsale.
The really important piece of Lusitania here is the Memorial Garden, which contains the names of all the people who sailed, both those who were lost and those who were saved. When you look at the sculpture out there, you will see that each name has a small symbol by the name. It's either a lifebelt for those who were saved or a cross on a wave which shows those who were lost. 1,200 people, more or less. Men, women, children and infants lost in that infamous event. And the wreck is out there. And I might add that this group here now own the wreck. It was donated to us by the previous owner, Mr. Greg Bemis, in appreciation of the work that we've done on Lusitania and preserving the memory of Lusitania. The U-boat that sank Lusitania fired one torpedo. The U-boat itself ran aground in Denmark shortly afterwards, and there's a museum in Jutland in Denmark which has got the conning tower and the periscope from U-20 in the museum. I was over there. Gerd Anderson, who runs the museum, actually cut a piece from the conning tower, a small piece, and gave it to us to bring back here and put on display. And the guy, Schwieger, the captain of that U-boat, was himself killed. His new boat, not the U-20, but another submarine, was depth charged, I think, and he was, and all his crew were lost in the North Sea. We have a commemoration every year on the 7th of May, which is the date that the Lusitania sank. I picked up a note from a lady on the west coast in the States last year. This lady was the granddaughter of a woman called Alice Middleton. Alice Middleton was on the Lusitania and was taken into Cove and was in the morgue for a couple of days when somebody realised that maybe this person was alive. And they took her to hospital and she did survive. Alice Middleton went back to the States eventually, and she was on the American version of This Is Your Life in the 50s. But as a result of that connection and me making the connection, this woman sent me Alice Middleton's money belt, which is like a tiny waistcoat that she wore when she sang on Lusitania. So we've actually got that. And you can imagine how many descendants there are of the 1962, wasn't it, on board on the day? 700 survived and 1,200 were lost. We had 5 groups dive Lusitania this year. They're just doing research. Because since the preservation order went on it, nobody's allowed to move anything, let alone take anything from the ship, from the wreck. The flag is the Cunard flag. The Cunard shipping line owned the Lusitania, and that flew on the Cunard building in London.
Kinsale's Lusitania graves. Margaret Mackenzie was from a small fishing village in the Scottish Highlands called Sheldag. She then immigrated to the United States, where she met James Shineman and married him in April 1915. They were due back to travel from Scotland on their honeymoon in May of 1915. However, they were requisitioned by the British Admiralty and were booked instead on the Lusitania. Tragedy struck the happy couple when the torpedo hit the ship. Although Margaret's body was recovered and brought ashore in Kinsale, she was not identified and buried with just "unknown victim of the Lusitania outrage" written on her grave. Several weeks later, however, the body of Margaret's husband James was washed up in County Clare, where the authorities were able to identify him through a pocket watch from Wyoming. Margaret Mackenzie has a plaque bearing her name in St. Maltas graveyard.
Welcome to the Church of St Maltos here in Kinsale. The present building was built in the 12th century by the Anglo-Normans who came over from Britain, but before that there had been a much earlier church here from the Celtic church tradition for some centuries before. There are no remains of that church. But when the Normans came here to Kinsale, it was one of the ports in Ireland that they wanted to take because of the important trade benefits of having ports here in Ireland. And so they built the town as a defensive position, a defensive place with walls all around it. And hence the church itself also has this military tower, the fortified tower, which is very high, as you can see. And it's here in the lee of the hill behind, and an important position from the wind, and also an important position as part of the defensive part of the town. And round the rest of the church there would have been battlements as well, because the people who came as the Anglo-Normans were thinking very much of themselves as the people who'd captured this bit of territory, and they were a little bit anxious or afraid of all the others that they'd pushed out and who were outside the wall. So we're here now at the door that we used to go into the church, but it actually was originally the door for the tower. This would have been the door into the tower, which goes up with several levels within it, where people actually lived, and people could prepare, if necessary, to defend the position if someone tried to come from outside. Here we are at the original west door of the church, the door that was originally the way in which everybody came in to the main part of the building. And we can see that it's a very ornate arch, part of the structure that was built in the 12th century. But of course now when we look through, we see that there is a wall, because someone in their wisdom towards the end of the 18th or early 19th century decided to put a gallery at the back of the church, and they needed to put a wall. So we can't use this as the normal entry into the church at this point. As we look at this, we see some of the interesting detail about here. Here we have the markings on both sides, where at some point we believe people sharpened their swords when they were coming here for whatever purpose, and they would have sharpened their swords on those bits of stone on the door. There we have an empty space, a slate that's there, but originally there was a figure of the person to whom this church is dedicated, St. Maltose. A little figure of St. Maltose used to be there. It's a figure that was built of sandstone, and that stone, being outside, was disintegrating in the elements, and so it was taken inside. And now I'm going to introduce you to Pam Norris, who is one of the two church wardens. Historically, the church wardens each carried one of these sticks, which were called wands. So we don't have any swords any longer, but the wardens still have their sticks. So the sticks were used in case people were causing trouble, coming to the entrance to the church, were going to cause a bit of trouble, and Pam could take her stick and encourage them to leave. As we see, we have a little symbol on the top of each of the two wands. A bishop traditionally wore a hat like in that shape called a mitre. And so that was the symbol of a person representing the church. The rector, the rector's church warden, the vicar's church warden, the priest's church warden carried this one. And this, of course, is a crown. And it represented the state. And then that was the one that was carried by the warden who was elected by the people. So you had the church warden carrying his wand, and the people's warden carrying the crown, representing the outside of the church, the rest of the state. So today, though, neither Pam nor the other church warden, Kevin, who are here, they don't use these on a Sunday, but if you do come along, they won't attack you with sticks today.
Unless you're really bad.
We saw above the door a place where there is now some slate, and in that place was this figure, the figure believed to be of St. Maltose. This is the figure that was originally from the outside above the west door. And it may be older than the church itself. On the other side of the wall that we encountered before, where the original west door would have let people in. The first thing that we come to here is the font, and that symbolizes the beginning of their journey at the entry place to the church as they come into the wider family of the church, if we think of it in those terms. As we look at it now, we see that, of course, it's all filled with these wooden pews. What if we use our imaginations, trying to think back several hundred years ago, there would have been no pews at all. It would have been an open space and used for people to gather as part of the whole community. The area up towards the altar would have been the sanctuary, it would have been railed off, but the rest could have been used for community gatherings and community meetings. And on the walls, there wouldn't have been any of the things that we see here, but there would have been murals, depictions of the biblical stories on the walls, because at the time people couldn't read, but they could understand the stories from what they had been told. And those people who were elderly or infirm were the people who could use the few benches that were towards the walls. And that's where we get the expression that a person is going to the wall, meaning they're getting a bit beyond it. They're getting beyond standing within the community. And so there would have been a few benches on either side for people to sit and rest during services or during other meetings. This was the only public building for many years that lots of people could gather in, and it would be used for all sorts of different community activities. We see on this side 3 of these that are called hatchments and 2 on the other side, and they would have been things that people used, wealthy people used at the time of their funeral to mark where their where the funeral procession, and then where the coffin was actually laid. And then here we have the royal coat of arms of King William the Third, because after 1690 the town was taken by the Duke of Marlborough, captured from King James II, and the royal coat of arms came to be in the town and were a sign of the person who was ruling the town on behalf of the monarch. And so we end up then getting other memorials within the building as Kinsale becomes a very prosperous place for merchants and a very important military base. So some of the other memorials that we have in different places are to people who in their day thought they were very important in business terms or in military terms. This was a very important military garrison town and an important naval port with a Royal Naval Dockyard and so on. So in the present side chapel that we have memorials to the Southwell family. Then we have memorials to the Dorman family and a couple of them who were killed in the First World War. But the stained glass work that's in here is mainly the work of Catherine O'Brien, who lived from 1881 to 1963. And she was a very important person as part of the Irish group called Antúr Glynn, the Tower of Glass. That Tower of Glass movement was a very important stained glass artistic movement using very vivid, very bright colours. We're going to move on to look at one of the other windows. We have a very interesting window here, one of a number that remember people who were killed in the First World War. And this is to a Stephen Henry Lewis, an officer in the Connaught Rangers, one of the Irish regiments that fought in the Great War. And we have here an interesting picture in his memory by his family. He actually was killed in August 1950 in Gallipoli in Turkey, and it was part of an attempt to land Allied forces and get through to Germany, coming in the back way away from the Western Front, and it failed, and thousands of people from Ireland were killed and injured as part of that attack, and many people from Australia and New Zealand. It was the first time that soldiers from Australia and New Zealand had ever fought together, and Australian people and New Zealand people on Anzac Day, they still today will have a gathering at dawn to remember what happened at Gallipoli. And the family of Stephen, in their imagination, they describe him in this window as a medieval knight in shining armour with a helmet and a sword. And the words, "I have fought the good fight," from the New Testament, they feel he's done his duty and he's receiving his heavenly reward from 4 different angels. But in fact, look at his face. Although their imagination tried to think of him as a medieval knight, they wanted his real face at the young age of 23 when he died. They wanted to capture exactly what he looked like too. So there is a very interesting depiction of a window remembering somebody from this community who died with the other 50,000 or so Irish people in the First World War. Here we see the remains of the Galway Chapel, and Geoffrey Galway, who was a very wealthy person in Kinsale in the 14th century, he paid money to have the chapel built in order that the priests of the time would continue to say prayers for him and his family after they had died. And that was typical of what some people with a lot of money at the time could have done. When it came to the later 15th, early 16th century and the Reformation, because the chapel had been dedicated to the Blessed Virgin Mary, that was something they didn't want to encourage. So it was closed, and the remains are here. You can see the roof has fallen in. Some of the things were brought inside the church and are now have been put more recently on the wall.
The early part of the 20th century was a time of great adventure in the frozen Antarctic waste. A time when explorers sought to test their endurance and document the uncharted wilderness of the South Pole. This heroic age of Antarctic exploration should have put two brothers from Kinsale into the history books. Their names were Timothy and Mortimer McCarthy. Mortimer and Timothy McCarthy were born in the 1880s in Lower Cove, a small, close-knit fishing community on the eastern shore of the bay just past Charles Fort. Both McCarthy brothers, seeking a career at sea, joined the Merchant Navy and Royal Navy Reserve. Little did they know they were to become crew members in two of the most famous Antarctic voyages in history. In 1914, Tim volunteered for the Imperial Trans-Antarctic Expedition led by Sir Ernest Shackleton, sailing aboard Endurance with fellow Irishman Tom Green. He quickly established a reputation as one of the most cheerful and reliable members of the Endurance crew. After Endurance was crushed by ice in November 1915, he distinguished himself in the open boat journey to Elephant Island. It was not surprising that when Shackleton decided to sail to South Georgia in search of help, McCarthy was chosen to be one of the boat's parties. The James Caird would have to sail through some of the roughest conditions in the world. It was a small, open, 22-foot lifeboat, which was reinforced by the carpenter aboard Endurance. The carpenter, who was charged with reinforcing the boat, was told by Captain Worsley that he too would have to make the journey to Elephant Island, so that he would reinforce it as well as humanly possible. Throughout the epic 17-day journey in the James Caird, he maintained his usual composure and professionalism, as the party sailed more than 1,450 kilometres through the treacherous sea of the South Atlantic. When the lifeboat finally reached South Georgia on May 10, 1916, Tim remained behind with two incapacitated members of the crew, Harry McNeish and Jack Vincent, while Shackleton, Crean and Worsley went in search of help from the whaling station at Stromness. After finally being rescued, Timothy McCarthy was immediately sent back to England. McCarthy was awarded the British Polar Medal for his part in the Endurance expedition. After a very short period of leave, Tim was called upon again for active service with the Royal Naval Reserve, serving as an able seaman. On March 16, 1917, Tim was serving as one of the gun crew aboard the tanker SS Narragansett when it was attacked by the German submarine U-44 off the south coast of Ireland. Unfortunately, the 28-year-old Timothy McCarthy was one of the 46 casualties. He never lived long enough to be married.
Mortimer sought naval service during the Second Boer War and was awarded the South Africa War Medal. The older McCarthy brother left the RN in 1907 and based himself in New Zealand, where he worked as a merchant seaman. In 1910, he volunteered to sail alongside Captain Robert Falcon Scott on the British Antarctic expedition, where he also served alongside Tom Crean. Accepted as one of the crew of the Terra Nova, he served as a member of the support parties during the Scots' ill-fated attempt on the South Pole in 1912 to 1913. After he returned from the voyage on the Terra Nova, he donated a harpoon gun from the expedition to the Kinsale Museum. On his return from the Antarctic, he was awarded the British Polar Medal by George V. He also later met the renowned Norwegian explorer Roge Amundsen, who gave him a penknife as a souvenir. Mortimer applied to sail with Shackleton on the Endurance expedition and was hoping to serve with his brother Tim in the Antarctic. Shackleton had, however, already picked his crew and could not find a place for him. Undeterred, he traveled to Tromsø, where he joined the Northern Exploration Company and traveled on an expedition to the Arctic. He rejoined the Royal Navy during the First World War and served aboard destroyers. In 1920, he returned to New Zealand, where he settled permanently. He married Ellen Coughlin of Kinsale in 1923. They had 3 sons. Mortimer was a charming man and was renowned as a storyteller. In 1963, he was one of the last 3 surviving members of Scott's expedition and was invited by the American Antarctic Survey to make a commemorative visit to the South Pole. He duly went, and then in his 80s was the oldest man ever to visit the South Pole until in 2016, Dr. Buzz Aldrin broke the record. Due to Mortimer's exploit, Mount Mortimer McCarthy in Antarctica was named in his honor. Mortimer McCarthy sadly died at the age of 85 in a house fire in New Zealand, 4 years after his return to the South Pole.
Despite the fact the McCarthy brothers had such a colourful career in polar exploration, there was little interest in them here in Kinsale until Mr. Terry Connolly, chairman of the Kinsale Historical Society, embarked on a campaign to raise their profile locally, and a memorial committee was duly formed. In September 2000, busts of Tim and Mortimer McCarthy were unveiled in Kinsale, cast in bronze by local sculptor Graham Brett. They replaced a pier road in the town park overlooking the sea. Mortimer McCarthy's son, Gerard McCarthy, and his grandson, Andrew McCarthy, travelled from New Zealand to attend the unveiling ceremony.
As Mr. Connolly said, the memory of these men is part of the history of this maritime town and must be preserved. It's important that we remember and that we pass on what we remember to the younger generation so that they can know their history. So, the next time you're in Kinsale, stop by their memorial and remember Kinsale's own Arctic heroes.